This video is for educational purposes only and not intended to replace the shop manual. Please double check all facts and information. Hello fellow flying brick riders. It's time to play Name That Part. If you guessed a steering friction dampener, you guessed right. This project documents what I did on my 92 BMW K75 at about 58,000 miles. The handlebars were getting more and more stiff. They were also indexed, meaning there was a notch in the center. What I did to correct that is I replaced all the steering bearings and races. I wasn't able to get the bearings properly tightened. When I tightened them up all the way, they were binding. When I backed off, there was some play. So be aware it's very challenging with the BMW design to get it right. Not long after doing this repair, I disassembled the forks on a friend's 1993 Virago, and the handlebars there had become so tight that it was hard to even move them. They were badly indexed in the center. All I did is clean them up a little bit, add grease, put everything back together, and even after 2 years the handlebars are perfectly fluid and smooth. And that convinced me that on most street bikes you're better off, if the bearings aren't really damaged, to just add grease. There's no need to actually cut the bearing up, you just use punches to drive it out. It's much easier. So grab your tools, grab some grease, and let's get started. I just took the top triple clamp off. There's a squeak. And indexing, that's where there's a notch right there in the center. I just struck this several times with a hammer and now it comes off. Spun this off by hand. This is called the locking sleeve. All came apart pretty easily. This was the most difficult, and probably the big nut initially. This took very little force once this was out, but while this was in, this thing doesn't want to move around, or it didn't want it for me. Unscrewing was simple because you can see on the threads they're clean and they still have grease on them. So the clamp and the whole assembly, pretty easy, and just slides down through here. You put tape on the threads of this thing to prevent damaging the rubber. I think. Nice and smooth. See a little bit of grit. There's a little bit of like sand and such there. And this is why they want you to thoroughly clean around the head tube before you disassemble it, but in this case, since we're replacing the bearings. Steering lock, I see these marks here. I'm not sure what that's all about. I do know my steering lock, I've gotten it to work once or twice, but most of the time it doesn't work. Okay, there's that fluid block thingamajig thing. I think you're supposed to loosen the screws first before fooling around with it. I'm not sure. I'm going to use my rotozip to cut the corner off this washer. The washer, which is too wide to fit through the race. Take your hammer, and now you can just work this around and try to knock it off evenly. The key thing when you do this bottom part, you don't want to forget this, what they call grease or dust seal or whatever. That's the edge of the lower race, and that's what you're hitting against, either with the washer or your hammer. The washer distributes the force a lot more evenly. It's better than just using what they call a drift, which is just like a long piece of metal. There's where the little thing lines up for that fluid block dampener. And there's another one on this side. Okay, there's that lower race. Okay, cannot fit in there this way. But take it with the cut, it goes up into the hole, and you can flip it. Remember, the reason that you cut the washer is just so you can slip it by the race and then insert it like that up there. Of course, you just want to try to hit it basically straight. Removing the races and the bearings is one thing. Putting them back in is another, because that takes precision so you don't damage it, or a little more skill. Just striking like that. As you begin to feel it move, or whether you do or don't, you want to look back at the bottom, see, is it coming out straight? Here's that fluid block dampener thingamajig. I cut the bearing with my rotozip, and that was because I didn't realize that it could just be punched out. I hadn't changed bearings in a long time, and that's what the direction said, is to cut it. The lower bearing came out pretty easily. It's almost off. I used these two holes in the bottom, just like this other part here, and I used a punch pin, and I went whack, and then give it a whack with the hammer here, and just alternate, or a little. Notice the dust seal under the bearing. There's two of them that you must order. Very important to put this nut on and keep it about flush here so the pressure is hit evenly. You don't want to mess these fine threads up. So you put your nut on there. Once I got a little tiny bit of space, and even before then, I sprayed the tube here with silicone, and the bottom 3/16 fits with some definite space, so you could go even a little bigger. And 5/32 is a perfect fit up here in the top. I was unable to get the bearing off until I ground down the metal burrs in this section here. I think that also may have been causing my steering lock to malfunction. It's held stationary, and this here slides within it, and that's what the special grease is for. Update June 2009. I had reassembled the bike and left this off, and in 2 years I never got a single fork wobble. The real cause of my wobble turned out to be misaligned forks. Here are two bearings from the dealer. Remember, they come with the races, but not the dust seals. Put this in the freezer, and it's still cold. I put this in the freezer, and it's warmed up by now. I did this one first. I worked left to right, figuring the top is the left, the bottom is the right. So I had this in the oven. I set my oven, which is lowest it goes at 170. I left the two parts, oven and refrigerator, in there for about maybe 15 minutes. And when I greased this part first, I also put the dust seal on first, which I highly recommend even before putting it in the refrigerator. Same thing here, so there's no chance of forgetting. It's also very important, that you have a concept in mind, the way the bearings are going to go on, like that, with the rollers facing each other. Once I put it on, I used the perfect driver, which is the old bottom race, because the old bottom race will only contact on this inner part right here. You don't want to push the bearing on the cage at all. So you take the thin part here, put that on there like that. Then I used a PVC pipe, which I'll say what the measurement is in a minute, which easily sat here. And I had a block of wood. I brought it right up in the kitchen so I could go right from oven and freezer to assembling. And I gave it a couple hits, and it just went on like nothing. It took probably barely a minute to do both of these. This is probably one of the trickier parts of the operation. Not really that easy to get the race started straight. This is the little tool. I ended up using 24mm deep impact socket to reach over the bolt thread. The bolt I bought was a little too long, because it's a carriage bolt. It's not threaded all the way, just for the first few inches. So down at the bottom, I used the copper spacer, which is used for doing the torque setting, or for torquing in the bearings. But this worked out pretty good. Here, second time, and the reason was I wanted to put the old race on top, because that will fit down through there. Because I'm not sure if the washer, which is just below the socket there, really fits into the groove the way the old race does. I wasn't quite sure at the bottom inside the tube that it was fully seated in there. Harbor Freight to the rescue. I used this Pittsburgh bearing bushing set. You can kind of see what it looks like. It's 50mm, 1.968 inches. First I had to knock it out because it was so it was cocked so much for the other method. With this thing I just stamped it, and it just went in really fast. Basically what happens is, it only presses on the race here on the edges. A bit of grit or something had fallen down from above or wherever. So it really is, I made a mistake here, but really this whole outside needs to be cleaned, and the upper thing, everywhere you can think of to get junk out of it. After putting a fresh set of gloves on, I took some of the wonderful Honda Moly 60 grease and took it and worked it into the rollers. I'm going to sand these later, just to take a little bit of the corrosion off. Okay, unfortunately this process is kind of deceptive. The book says